Call to order this session of the Tacoma Park City Council. Will the clerk call the roll?
Mayor Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Kovar. Councilmember Duvalla.
Here.
Councilmember Costick. Here. Councilmember Siemens.
Present.
Councilmember Smith.
Here.
Councilmember Searcy.
Great. All right. Before we kick off with our presentation, we don't really have announcements tonight, but I do have one that I want folks to know that a number of people in the community are putting together a gathering tomorrow evening, October 30th at 7 p.m. at the gazebo near Old Town across the street from Roscoe's to bear witness and stand against violence. We mourn the loss of the 11 Jewish people slaughtered while in worship in Pittsburgh and the loss of 2 African-American people killed in Kentucky at a grocery store after their killer tried and failed to gain entrance to a historically black church to attack people at worship there. Please join with neighbors for a candlelight vigil to honor the people lost, bear witness, and offer support to our neighbors who are struggling. And that will be tomorrow evening if people would like to join us. All right, now we'll move on. Tonight we have a presentation from the Emergency Management Committee, Stop the Bleed program, and then we'll move on to our work session on housing. It's not, what are they, there's not emergency management. Preparedness, I thought so. I looked at that, I was like, that's all right. The Emergency Preparedness Committee. If you all want to take it away? Okay.
Hi, my name is Claudine Schweber. I'm co-chair with Ron Hardy of the Emergency Preparedness Committee. And I want to say that the reason we're here this evening, we want to thank you for the opportunity to share information about our newest project called Stop the Bleed. Stop the Bleed is an outgrowth of the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012. As a result of that shooting, the American College of Surgeons, several military personnel, medical personnel, and federal agencies met to develop programs to enhance their survival from mass casualty and active shooter events. And as you know, we've had another active shooter event just a couple of days ago. Stop the Bleed was one of a series of projects that they developed, and the whole point is to empower the general public to make a difference in a life-threatening emergency by teaching people the basic techniques of bleeding control. And the goal is to train every American to do these bleeding control techniques effectively. You should have materials, both graphics, some graphics and a card that shows you the procedure, and we also have that in Spanish. Our intent is to do, and we're starting with a pilot of 3 sessions in November and December, which we will then assess and then decide based on the assessment what might need changing or not in order to move forward. The training will be done by Satchel Kornfeld, who's a qualified instructor, an EPC member, and a volunteer EMT in Montgomery County. So Ron will now talk further about this and the program. We can answer questions about your materials and exactly what it is we want from you. Thank you.
Good evening. Ron Hardy, Emergency Preparedness Manager for the City of Tacoma Park. We're here tonight to remind everyone that loss of blood is the leading cause of death for any traumatic incident. The Stop the Bleed program teaches the everyday person how to control bleeding using direct pressure, pressure bandages, and tourniquets. By teaching more people out there, we know that first responders from police, emergency service, fire rescue take time to get to the scene of an incident. It could be a mass shooting, or it could be a simple incident at your own home or place of work where somebody severely cuts themselves and you need to stop the bleeding. The average person only has about 4 liters of blood in their body, and a person can easily go into shock if the bleeding is not controlled. The Stop the Bleed program has already taught over 124,000 people nationwide. It is a worldwide program. The Stop the Bleed, again, as she said, was endorsed and put together by the American College of Surgeons. So it's made by doctors for the lay people. We have 3 scheduled training sessions coming up. First one is Wednesday, November 7th, 7:30 in the Azalea Room. Next one is Saturday, November 17th, 10:30 in the Azalea Room. And December 15th at 2:30 in the Azalea Room. Once we make our assessment, see what the community thinks of the program, we're hoping to offer more classes in the spring. I'm hoping to maybe be an instructor myself by attending these and going over the lesson plans, which I've already printed out. I hope to be able to offer more classes along with Satchel. So far, we have 16 people signed up for those 3 dates. The good news is we have 3 from wards 1, 2, 3, and 5. We're looking for more people. In your handouts, we have our application flyer, which I will also email to you later after we break tonight. And you can hopefully send it out and encourage more people to sign up for this training. If possible, we'd like to see you attend at least one of the sessions if you can make it, at least see what's going on. We do have some of the materials already, but in the future, if this goes according to our plan of getting more people involved, we may need to buy more materials to teach the classes. So I'm hoping you will support this program that the EPC is putting on, and I think it's a very good one that everyone should get involved in. Any questions?
Okay, Councilmember Siemens, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. First, I would like to say that I commend you for putting this program together. I think it is the best event that the committee has done since its inception many years ago. I think it's targeting exactly the concerns that we should be targeting with the way the events have been laying out across the country. I was looking at the flyer real quick as you spoke, and I didn't see anything on here with the dates and times. Is that on one of these?
If you go to the back of your
Oh,
handouts,
on the application.
it's all the way down at the bottom.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
And the
It's at the
rest
bottom.
is, yeah, I think it's great. I really appreciate your doing this.
Yeah, it's at the bottom.
yeah,
The
I-
sheet with the EPC circles.
I see that, and I'll make sure to get that distributed in Ward 4. We need to have Ward 4 residents participating in this program. I know that many of them are listening now, and this is something where it's a help yourself and help your neighbors kind of thing to learn. I look forward to this being successful and also hearing your thoughts on how you can continue this type of first aid training in the community.
Thank you.
I do want to add that each person who goes through the training will get a certificate of completion. This is not a.
Might want to use the microphone.
That everybody who goes through the training will get a certificate of completion, which is not being certified to be a trainer or anything, but it will
Right.
show that they've completed that, and that might help if they need to do it any other
Right.
time, use that.
Councilmember Smith?
Thank you guys for organizing this. I guess it's really relevant. Will those people that participate get free tourniquets? One, so that just in case something does happen, they can have the supplies at home. And two, what do you guys think of the quick clot powder that's used when people are bleeding? Is that something that we should give to people also?
Well, No, we don't give out any supplies. We don't want to, give something and by endorsing a certain product to people. Quick Clot comes in many different forms. They use the hemostatic gauze for the general public and the EMTs around here. The powder was made for war wounds. It has a lot of particles in it, and surgeons really have to flush out a lot of that to do repair. So the gauze is more acceptable practice right now.
Okay, thank you.
Great. All right, I'm gonna pass down my form, so I don't want to get it, I want to sign up and not forget. So, Mr. Hardy, if you could take that, that would be awesome.
And the rest of you, please do that.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. All right, now we'll turn our attention to our work session this evening, which is a continued discussion of the housing component of the draft Housing and Economic Development Strategic Plan. And we have Ms. Daines with us.
And Ms. Wiggins, you can.
Oh, and Grace is here too. Great. Oh, that's fine.
So I'm pleased that we'll kind of do the next step in the discussions that we've had most recently for several days, but that's been going on with public outreach and study for actually a couple years now. And so what I was asking Ms. Daines to go through is the information that was sent out to you by email and posted online early today. My goals for tonight are to try to see if this makes sense as an approach, give some feedback on the text, on the ideas for indicators, and talk through a little bit. I'd like to get your sense a little bit about how strongly you might want to kind of make a statement as to a vision of a housing plan for Tacoma Park. And so I'll turn it over to Ms. Daines, and we'll have suddenly our monitors went blank. One of the things that you'll notice as we go through, there's several different objectives that were mentioned, but one of the things that wasn't mentioned but was put into the cover sheet had to do with the ongoing work that we do every day of program support for tenants and for landlords and for those who would like to purchase homes and that kind of thing. Because those are more steps rather than strategies or an end in themselves, they're not objectives, ends in themselves, we took them out of that, but they would be incorporated in getting us to the other objectives that are listed here. I know a number of you have some objectives and actual strategies that you are interested in, so it'll be fun to go through and hear about that. But I do think that we've got a pretty good start to go through today. And now that the screen is up, Ms. Daines, you're on.
Before we begin, if you have not had an opportunity to meet her, I'd like to introduce Grace Wiggins. Ms. Wiggins is our new, she has a really long title, but basically manager of the Housing and Community Services Division. She's been here less than a month.
That's right.
And she is wonderful, so I'm so glad she's here. With that, many of these slides you'll recognize from our conversation earlier this month. That's assuming I can get this going. So as the city managers indicated, we're going to do a quick run through, and the primary focus of this conversation tonight is to get feedback from the city council in terms of whether or not the vision, the goals, the strategy, and the objectives. This is not my presentation. Sorry. Nope, this is from last week. That's why it looks so familiar. Can I get access to the internet?
Yes.
Sorry about this, everyone. Okay, because Jesse has posted this on the city council's website, so it'll be so much easier. Sorry about that, Bien. Yes. Oh, that would be smart. Okay. Okay, I think I'm going to use this. This is the challenge of being really organized and getting everything set up in advance. There, okay. So the last one did look like last week's, or the other week's presentation, because in fact it was, but this is a little different. As the city manager has indicated, the focus of the conversation this evening is on getting impact from council members regarding whether or not we're on the right track. So we're going to do a quick overview of how we got to this point this evening, revisit the vision plan or the vision statement, a livable community for all, or the housing goal, quickly go over the strategy and objectives, and then a new element here are the indicators that we have included as opposed to the specific actions or toolbox. Those will, in fact, come at a later date once you have finalized or given us further direction in terms of what you'd like to accomplish. So as previously noted, this is a component of a larger strategic plan that included economic development. The strategic plan itself was initiated back in March of 2017, and over a period of 6 months, we did a variety of data analysis and reached out to the community to get their input in terms of what was appropriate and a priority for them. The draft plan was presented to the City Council roughly a year ago at the end of October, and since that time, we've had a housing forum. We hosted a series of open houses and are revisiting the draft this month. As noted during the prior presentations, this is a plan that focuses on housing affordability, not affordable housing. There's a difference in terms of being able to provide a range of housing options for people at a variety of economic levels. Oops. The vision statement that's included in the draft plan is a compilation drawn from the council priorities that were identified earlier in development or in preparation for the FY19 budget. It was expanded to include issues that were identified during the community outreach process, and I believe Councilmember Kovar had some suggestions that he sent out to the City Council earlier regarding modifications that could be made to this. As you see, it is, don't want to read it to you, but it again addresses the whole housing affordability component in terms of providing a range of housing to a variety of people with very different backgrounds, and also addresses the fact that it should be across all socioeconomic groups. housing goal itself that was developed for the draft plan is pretty straightforward. It's an overarching goal that the objectives and the indicators and the toolbox are designed to address. And again, to provide a range of safe, quality, affordable, and stable housing options and opportunities that are available to all residents in all neighborhoods throughout the community. As noted in the strategic statement that we've included here, the focus is on the preservation of existing housing, the production of new housing, and the protection of interests of all residents. We've identified 6 housing objectives. They're based on the goal, which is again drawn from the data analysis and the community input. And they include a range of housing options and opportunities, as stated earlier in the vision and the goal statements, available to all residents and all neighborhoods. So the first 2 address homeownership and rental opportunities in neighborhoods that are attractive and appealing to a variety of residents throughout the community, and also to maintain the affordability and physical condition of our current housing stock. The third objective is to offer a variety of housing types for a diverse demographic, and several of those focus groups, if you will, were identified in the vision statement regarding race, abilities, income levels. We've also included within the draft plan an objective regarding the facilitation of moderate and higher density infill development and mixed-use residential development. And that's primarily in wards that we've identified coming up in the indicators. And then last but not least is an objective that is focused primarily on the City Council in terms of what you can do to help advance the strategic plan regarding housing, and basically advocating for policies, legislation, regulation, and funding from a variety of sources, including the City Council, county, state, other governmental entities, as well as nonprofit partners. Okay. So this is a lot easier with the PowerPoint. I'm sorry, guys. I think we're almost, okay, there we are. Okay. We've included as example a number of indicators that are designed or intended to advance the objectives that you've identified within the strategic plan, or will identify in the final strategic plan. It's important to know that there are benchmarking tools, and they are intended to be long-term, and that should be revisited periodically throughout the process as the plan goes forward. It's a means of evaluating the progress that is being made towards your goal and objectives. And it's also important to note that the indicators may impact one another. And that's particularly true if you look at this slide in terms of increasing home ownership rates in wards 4 and 5, which have historically the highest rates of rental housing compared to home ownership. If you increase that the home ownership rates in there, that it has an impact in terms of potentially rental opportunities are available within those wards. And then conversely, the same is true in terms of increasing rental housing rates in wards 1, 2, and 3. Those wards were identified based on information that was gathered from the ACS, the American Community Survey. Roughly in wards 4 and 5, roughly 3/4 of the people live in rental housing, and in wards 1, 2, and 3, roughly 3/4 of the people own their own home. So you can see that there's a real difference from a geographical basis in terms of how those different housing options are distributed throughout the community. Another indicator that could be used to mark progress in this area is to look at walkability scores. One thinks that in Tacoma Park, every place is walkable. So for giggles, I went and pulled up a couple of addresses, and up on University Boulevard in Merrimack, where MHP owns the property, there the walkability score is 85. But in the area where Councilmember Siemens lives on Ritchie Avenue, the walkability score there is 49. So there's a huge range. I honestly wasn't expecting that much of a difference between the areas, but it would be one way of indicating how attractive the community and the neighborhood is for the people that live in that particular area.
As long as we keep the streetlights bright enough.
Really bright so you don't trip when you walk.
For,
right?
for walkability, I assume that that has to do also with access to stores and other services, right? So there's a variety.
Sidewalk services,
Lots of things.
lighting, I'm just guessing, transportation, et cetera. But
So-
these are just examples that could be used to indicate progress in this towards achieving this particular objective. There are a couple of points I'd like to make here is that, again, one indicator may appear on the surface to be the opposite of another indicator that may identify later on. It's also important to note that any indicators that you decide to include within the strategic plan need to be relevant. They need to measure an aspect or a fundamental aspect of your housing goal or the objective. They need to be easy to understand, reliable, so that the information that is used to mark progress in a particular area people trust, and is accessible, so that information we're pulling up today we'll be able to pull up again in 10 years. So we're looking at very specific resources in terms of where that data may come from. It also needs to inspire, if you will, action towards achieving your overarching housing goal. I've included percentage increases in these examples, and you may want to do that, or you may not want to do that. You may want to just include as an indicator an increase in home ownership rates in these wards. But again, that's up to the City Council as far as how it wishes to proceed. The other thing to take into consideration as you go through and look at the indicators is that there are a variety of factors that impact progress in these particular areas, primarily resources, not just staff capacity, but resources from a financial standpoint that might be available to the city that you have direct control over, but also other resources like land and program opportunities.
I'd like to jump in just for a second. One of the things that I think is really important here is that very few jurisdictions have measurable goals for their housing plans. It's just not common. And, but when there's discussions with those jurisdictions, it's clear that having those actual measurable goals has changed the nature of the conversations that they have in their community. And it really shows, it's something that keeps reminding them, well, we still have only 10% X, and we're really trying to get to 18%, and so how are we going to make those tough choices? I also, in putting this forward, think that it's really helpful, not just as we look at the goals overall, but when there's a J&A, what do we do with this property? And we say, well, are there some of these goals, are there some steps that would advance us in some specific indicators? And that kind of changes the discussion a little bit from what does the current zoning allow to what is our vision, how does it make the whole entity work of the city? The final thing I'll just mention, you didn't mention, you plugged in, Sarah, a time frame of up to from 2019 to 2030. It's not that far away. So it's not real long term. This will be only 10 years after the Purple Line opens, and well, actually 8 years after the Purple Line opens. And so it'll be, this is a pretty midterm kind of goal setting, you can decide to change that or have like interim steps as you go through it. But I urge you also to think in those timeframes and to have those discussions.
Thank you. While we have this indicator up on the screen now, I know you've talked about the fact that, these things, indicators affect each other. But my concern with the increasing home ownership rates in Ward 4 is that probably, 85% of the residences are rental properties. And an easy way to attain that goal is to convert them to condominiums. So we, significantly increased the percent of ownership in Ward 4 several years ago when a number of the buildings converted to condominiums. And I think what we really want to do is convert the residents from rentals to home ownership. And of course, if they do that by buying a house somewhere else outside of the ward, they haven't increased the home ownership rate in Ward 4. So I'm not sure we're measuring the desirable thing here.
And that also goes back to the conversation about looking at the goal of providing equal or affordable housing options, or, excuse me, I was not going to say it that way. The housing options across the community, so that in Ward 5, for example, where Councilmember Smith lives, a majority of the properties in that particular area are rental properties, and that's frankly where you see a majority of the rent subsidized properties in the community. So if you want to look at it from a geographical standpoint and sort of mix things up a little bit, there are consequences to that. We were talking earlier today about, okay, so if we have this here for Ward 4, to have a significant impact, you're looking at converting one of the apartment buildings to condominiums. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it desired or not desired? That's what you guys get to decide.
There's another aspect here, and this is something that as we go through these discussions, it'll be interesting to focus on. But in reviewing data on health indicators that just got put out by COG and some other ways of kind of identifying where are there real challenges for residents versus an opportunity to be more successful over time. There's a real discussion about having stronger integration between different types of housing and different communities close to each other so that they build off of each other and familiar with each other. So as we go through this, there's a little bit of social engineering perhaps that we can debate the extent to which we want to have go on.
So I'm disappointed
My argument with the condominiums is, for example, that if there were a building though to change or part of a building to change, we would want to make sure that we're gaining something from a different ward so that it's balancing as an overall.
Yeah, that's what I was
ward.
just going to say. I'm disappointed that Councilmember Kovar is not here tonight because I'm envisioning the counterbalance would be a high-density high-rise in Ward 1.
That's right, or a lot of ADUs or a variety of things. So I mean, I think that there is. I think that's going to be the fun part of the discussion.
And actually, so I would like Ms. Daines to finish going through this because I want to go back to the beginning because I had some points on that. But before I lose this train of thought, one of the things I do think is important is in part of this discussion that I wrote in my notes was also having overall targets. So not just the ward targets, but having these overall targets so that there's this give and take with them. And then also maybe thinking in terms of ranges rather than just a X percentage going up. So it might be a little easier, but why don't we let you continue to go through.
Yeah, why don't we go through these and then come back around?
Before I do that, one of the things that the council might want to think about too is right now you have, it used to be primarily rental units in Tacoma Park. It used to be 60-40 was the split. Now you are at 47% rental housing units, with 53% of the housing units available in the city as owner-occupied. So there has been this gradual shift over to home ownership as opposed to rental. Is that good or bad? It depends on the community and the makeup of the
Not so bad.
population, not for the,
I mean,
it
I've
dep-
been on
no,
the
it's
council
ser-
for the time that that's happened, and
Yeah.
I'm not that old.
no, you're not. So that's something else to take into consideration as you go through and look at the recommendations in the strategic plan in terms of, do you want to maintain that split? Do you want to increase it? Flip it back to the way it was before? I mean, that's part of the conversation, and that will have an impact in terms of the type of programming that's available and the, how resources are directed.
And what
And, I'm sorry,
facilitated the change? Why did we go
you're not on the mic.
The question was what facilitated the change. My assumption is that a lot of it happened when several of the apartment buildings in the area were converted over to condominiums. So that may not be the only reason, but I think it contributed to the switch. It's been happening
Right,
over
and I think
time. It's
that-
very
I
gradual.
think that was spurred on by the housing boom that
Mhm.
we experienced several
There's
years ago.
also been a real change in that families that had buildings that had a couple units have wanted to stay, and they've turned it into a single-family home, for example.
Yeah.
But I think that it raises a different point, which is the numbers and the mix of people and options in Tacoma Park will change on its own
Mhm.
without action by you. So part of this is recognizing that, we're not just gonna just stay frozen like this. It will change.
One of the things that we've been doing with the rental housing licensing programming is adding additional information regarding when licenses were discontinued and the reason for the discontinuation. And a lot of them are single-family properties that come on and go off the market
Mhm.
depending upon what the circumstances are. Or as the city manager has indicated, 4 flats that have been turned into 2 units, or someone decided to acquire it and renovate it as a single-family property. Okay. We've identified 6 indicators that would advance or could be used as a means of measuring progress made in terms of the maintaining the long-term affordability and physical condition of the existing housing stock. And as you can see, they range from a variety of options, including addressing the percentage of residents that are housing cost burdened. That applies to both homeowners as far as renters. To be considered housing cost burdened, you're essentially paying more than 30% of your income for housing costs. When the strategic plan was developed, homeowners, 23% of Tacoma Park's homeowners were considered housing cost burdened, and renters were a little under 40%. We also have an option of looking at how the price of housing compares to the area median income, and that's where you could get into some of the ranges that you're talking about. So for example, if you decide that you want to identify a group of housing that's available for individuals that are 80% of the AMI, we would just work backwards to see how that calculates regarding rent levels as well as home ownership. We could consider reducing the number of vacant housing units, those units that are on the vacant property registry, and also looking at ways of monitoring the number of housing property maintenance code violations in the rental properties that are inspected, or in increase in the number of biennial rental licenses that we issued. Biennial rental licenses are issued for those properties that have 5 or fewer code violations per unit. So that would be one way of gauging whether or not we're maintaining and improving the condition of the existing housing stock.
And how many do we have in the number of vacant housing units?
Yeah.
What's that number?
Do you remember?
I don't. We can find out.
We can get that information for you.
All right.
There are a couple of indicators that you could use to measure progress in working towards providing access to a variety of housing types that are diverse or interest to a diverse population. We've identified 4 here that could appeal to young families, individuals that are single individual households, as well as folks that just basically prefer living with a larger group of people, as well as townhouse units in terms of adding diversity to the housing stock itself. So Tacoma Park has a lot of 1 and 2 bedroom units, and if you look at the strategic plan, that sort of fits with the population, but it's one of those chicken and egg conversations. The population works because that's the type of units that are available, but if you're interested in attracting or providing housing for young families that may be need more space, it could be an indicator would be, or a way of attracting that population or housing that particular population or cohort group would be to look at increasing the number of larger apartment or housing properties. Accessory dwelling units is another option, which would deal with or provide a means for seniors to age in the community. Registered owner-occupied group houses is also an option. And again, these are just examples. There are more that could be added. For the 5th indicator, we have, we're looking at redevelopment and are looking at adding potential indicators addressing high-rise, higher-density residential and mixed-use developments along the New Hampshire Avenue corridor in wards 2, 3, and 6. And then also looking at a more moderate density residential and mixed-use developments in Ward 5 and 6. And those wards were selected primarily because of the redevelopment potential and properties that we are aware of that could at some point in the future be redeveloped from their current use. And then last but not least is the indicator regarding advancement of the housing goal through advocacy. And we've identified 2. One is to maintain a budget that's set aside specifically for housing affordability from the City Council's budget, as well as tracking dollars that are invested by our partners, be they other governmental entities or nonprofit partners. And that's it for the indicators. Essentially, what we're hoping you'll provide us this evening is some input in terms of if we're on the right track, particularly as far as the vision statement, the goals and the strategy and objectives, and then any input you have in terms of the indicators that we've identified as possibilities. Going forward, we would more firmly establish the indicators and develop an implementation plan, which is where we would go into a more in-depth conversation regarding the tools and programs that might advance those goals and objectives that you've identified.
Great, thank you. So why don't we go back to the beginning, and we can start with the vision statement. If anyone, as Ms. Daines mentioned, our colleague, Councilmember Kovar, who is not with us tonight, sent us some very lovely notes.
Can I ask a question of
yeah.
information first?
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Just to, before I forget it,
Mhm.
to hear more about the experience of the communities that do have indicators, either now or in the right part of the conversation.
Sure, we can get back to you. I've been listening to a number of presentations on housing with representatives from some of those jurisdictions. And the thing that I liked hearing was from some of their staff saying that they found that once the council had set fairly aggressive indicators and metrics, that they worked harder at it and actually did more than staff thought they would. So, you know, it was one of these things where it just helped to see it as a number or a percentage, as a real tangible goal. And so they felt like they were making faster progress than they might otherwise have done. And I think it also gave a little more ownership to the council of that, as opposed to saying, well, staff just wants to see more X or whatever. It was like, no, the council set these, and so they're working for them. And so it just sounded like a better cooperative working arrangement. I'm happy to
More,
share
yeah,
more
more
information on that.
specifics.
Sure.
I always like more specifics.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Great, all right. Looking at the vision, a livable community for all, Councilmember Kovar has suggested adding to the list of provides opportunities to all regardless of age, race, ethnicity, citizenship status, or ability, gender identity, or sexual orientation. I'd like to agree with that, move that forward. Yeah.
So one of the things with that, and I think as we get into this, we may never be able to identify all the different categories. So some of this may come out of data, and some of this may come out of community input. Obviously, most of these things, it's illegal to discriminate based on a variety of these categories. The question is, are we helping to address the various needs and desires? And so I think that's where that input will be really helpful.
Councilmember Smith?
Sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
you can go to someone next.
Oh, okay. All right. Councilwoman Costick, sorry.
I agree that I would like to add gender identity and sexual orientation to that list. I also think we should consider rephrasing that rather than saying provides opportunities to all regardless of age, race, etc., to something similar to providing opportunities for all through embracing the community's diversity of age, race, ethnicity. Something that, to me, regardless, suggests that we should be looking at things differently, and I think we should be embracing it more than just looking at exceptions. I also, and I had a few other thoughts, and I was trying to go back and see, I know we have several of these, of the priorities, and I'm not sure if some of the things I was thinking of for this might actually be in the quality of life priority, but I was thinking in the last point, is sustainable, accessible, and affordable across all socioeconomic groups. It struck me that it might be relevant to include safe there, and I'm not sure if that's something that is already included elsewhere, but I think that's an important characteristic related to housing.
Yeah, it certainly is implied, but being clear about it is great.
Any other comments or thoughts on the vision statement?
I will just note that today we got back some of the information on the focus groups for the resident survey, and some of the questions that were raised, and we haven't seen all of the detailed comments that were made in those focus groups, but had a lot to do with kind of what they want near where they live, whether it's childcare or some other kinds of services. So, that's also part of the livability of the question. But as we go through this, thinking about that, especially when we're doing redevelopment or even refurbishing a building, what other services might be appropriate for it for the mix that we're trying to get.
Great. And I just asked the city manager, since not everyone may remember that we are undergoing a series of focus groups and a community survey this year, but we had, during our budget discussion last year, added additional funding to the community survey in order to do focus groups with harder to reach populations. And so we did 3 focus groups, is that correct, if I'm remembering right? All right, well, Deputy City Manager's not looking up, so we'll get back, but we will report more on this at a later date. But all right, anything else on the vision statement? Okay. Next then, we had the housing goal, to ensure that a range of safe, quality, affordable, and stable housing options and opportunities are available to all residents in neighborhoods throughout the community. Anyone have any? Yeah.
Okay, so I'm annoying.
Mhm.
My father always used to get at me for saying quality, because quality could be good quality or bad quality.
Mhm.
So I prefer, we may want to put a
High quality.
high quality or good quality, yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. But here, there is safe, that doesn't mean it shouldn't be in the vision statement,
Mhm.
but we did call that out.
Councilman Costick?
Sorry, my notes are all over the place here, so I'm not really sure what all goes where with each category. But I was also thinking in terms of the city manager's comment regarding the additional services that are offered to people, whether it's access to nearby grocery stores that sell healthy food, or childcare, transportation access to transit. And I feel like that needs to be included somewhere, and I'm not sure where the best place for that is. So if it's possible to explore adding something to the vision, to the goal, I think in the strategy and objectives, there could be some aspects related to that, but I think something that sort of expresses a desire to not just have people living here, but thriving through accessibility to these sorts of things.
One of the things that you might want to keep in mind as you have this conversation, that this is just half of the strategic plan.
Right.
The other half deals with economic aspects of the community at large. And while there's overlap, which is kind of why we had them combined, there may be some things that would be appropriate to include in the second half.
And I'll give one example that kind of piggybacks on what Ms. Costick just said. When my mom lived in Victory Tower, one of the things that she found was a real problem was that to get affordable food, they had to take a bus.
Mhm.
You know, that was not walkable. And so the things that were closer to them were not things that they could actually use. And, you know, it's one of these things where it's good to have the facility, but it wasn't useful, it wasn't as well placed for them. And so as we think about how the demographics and the different kinds of units are placed geographically, thinking about, they don't have to be on the same property, but they need to, how do they work together? And that goes into the walkability score to an extent, as well as just how we look at economic development.
Councilman Searcy?
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate what Ms. Dane said about, you know, the way I see it is this, the vision is an umbrella, right? That will cover many aspects of what the whole person would need, right? So you need housing, you need access to healthcare, you need education or access to education, you need all of these things. And so if our goal or our vision is to create this livable community for all, this housing goal is just one piece of that broader puzzle for creating that livable community. You can even include aspects related to the tree canopy goal and you know, environmental aspects. So I kind of like, again, to think of this as one piece of a larger puzzle that we're tackling in many different facets. So I get your point about like the whole needs of the person and making sure that we're accounting for it. I'm just not sure if the housing, like the housing programs and projects that we would have underway would necessarily target those specific things. It may be in some of our economic development activities, or it may be through some of our, you know, health focused initiatives and the like that might get at some of those things, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I just had a quick question related to that. Is there, I mean, I don't disagree at all with you that I think we need to focus this on and not get too broad. At the same time, I'm wondering, as we're delving into this looks at housing, we're looking at economic development in this plan. Is there really a place, and is that a separate sort of category? Is that a separate thing we need to investigate and develop a plan for in terms of really sort of the placement of these services and the access that people have to healthcare, to childcare.
I think that goes. I mean, we're putting together a puzzle here, and so partly we're identifying people and people's needs, and we're identifying we have this land and these buildings that already exist or could be developed. I think in particular when we're looking at the people and what are the people's needs, that ends up being a subset of those things, and so. It may not fall into a housing pot, but as we go through this strategy and then the indicators, when we get down to, we're gonna do a tax cut for so-and-so, or we're gonna do this kind of an incentive, or we're going to build this kind of a building, we can indicate, why this place or why this concept helps meet the needs of these people that we're trying to meet that gap. So, I guess I see the need to keep we'll go through the housing things, but I see lots of asterisks and footnotes that tie to these other things. So we don't forget them because they're important.
I would just, excuse me, I would just reiterate that you had passed along a report from the Council of Governments today that talks about this very complexity that
Right.
Councilmember Searcy brought up.
So I was just also going to add that, because I think the point that Councilwoman Costick raises, and I think when we met with CHEER in a group of residents that they had gathered talking about their needs, I wonder if it is, without getting it too broad, if we said something like, to ensure that a range of safe, high-quality, affordable, stable housing options and opportunities that meet residents' basic needs are available to all residents in neighborhoods throughout the community, or some language like that, because to me, that at least keeps it in the picture. So I think this was actually something Councilmember Smith raised a few weeks ago, which is we know childcare and affordable childcare is a real need in our community. And so when we're talking to people who are developing maybe more apartment but multifamily units, or talking to folks who come to us and ask for pilots, is providing places where childcare can be delivered part of what the conversation. So I think having some language in there without it getting too cumbersome and having everything, but talks about meeting basic needs, would be a reminder to us as we're having these conversations to come back to what are those basic needs. Let's make sure people aren't living in food deserts and they're near, they have food, they have childcare, those types of things. So I'd like us to explore that maybe.
So to what extent, and this is just me being, the person that's sometimes responsible for reporting to higher ups about how your program specifically achieved the stated goal. So I typically hold people very firm to the stated goal. So if the goal, as we describe it, includes all of these other facets, then my mind automatically goes to, okay, what programs do we have that relate to housing and these other things, these basic needs that we say that we're going to try to address? And then we would select indicators that would be based on those activities.
Right.
So if the idea is that we want to make sure that our programming includes these aspects, that's great. I'm more inclined to say we have aspects that we haven't talked about just yet related to like recreational services, which you could logically connect to childcare to some degree. In theory, you open up more slots for recreational services before and after care, you may meet some of those childcare needs, or when we're talking about things like the services that the library can provide. So I'm more inclined to say that the needs of childcare would better fit maybe with recreational services, including the library and those kinds of, because that's typically where those services would fall. Unless we're talking about, hey, when we're developing new projects, we're gonna prioritize childcare facilities. That still wouldn't fall under housing. That would be more with the economic development piece. Unless what we're saying with housing is we want to prioritize those housing projects that include recreational rooms, like we force them to make recreational space available in new developments for the purpose of providing these types of services to So it's just, I'm just mentally trying to compartmentalize.
One of the things that I think is very special about Tacoma Park is that it's small, it has really good transportation, and it is largely walkable. And those aren't found in many places. So we have a mix of rental and homeowners, and they're not far apart from each other, and sometimes they're right next to each other. So if you compare us to other jurisdictions, we're a real step forward. Now, sometimes they're farther than's comfortable if you're trying to get to services, but part of this is like what service needs to be right next to you and what service can be a little farther apart, and do we have the services, the transportation or other kinds of things that work on that. So part of this, some priorities are going to be higher than others for certain populations and certain locations, and so I think we just have to remember that and think about it. I don't think there's an answer necessarily whole side on the whole scale. We're just very fortunate that we actually have a workable size to start with.
All right, Councilwoman DeBala.
Oh, I was gonna weigh in by saying I like a more focused goal. And I notice in strategy that the second one lends itself, I was thinking about adding this as another strategy, but it lends itself really nicely to the second one. So I would look at it more that way. I also backed up going a level up higher to the vision. And again, I think it's in here, not specifically called out. So if we're going to specifically call it out, I think it fits better under the strategies, which would still mean, as Councilmember Searcy said, that you'd want to have some indicator to show how you measure that, and that at some point you'd want a program to help you get there. But I don't think I want to take too much focus off the housing goal.
All right, Councilmember Smith.
A couple things. One, my concern with this is that we get too far ahead of ourselves on, trying to provide things for residents that we just do not have the power to do. I mean, we can say, yes, we want people to have grocery stores or more options for people in our community, but the way our economic development, or hopefully economic development, is set up in the city, we can't solve that problem. I mean, DC, which has a lot bigger budget than we do, can't solve food deserts in some of their wards. So I don't want us to tell residents, current residents and future residents, that we're going to, hopefully have health care or access to grocery stores, and we just can't do that. I mean, we just don't have the resources other than, make a public statement that that's aspirational, that is something that we would want to happen. Now, getting to the point that Councilmember Searcy made about healthcare, or not healthcare, but childcare, the reason I brought that up is because we could actually incentivize developers to provide that in a project, either through the pilot program or getting money from the state and help with the build out of childcare facilities. So I would like to see if we could do things that we could actually find a way, either through state and federal resources, that can provide some of these things for residents, rather than just saying that we're going to offer the Christmas tree, but we can only provide one rung of lights for residents.
I guess on that one, I'd like to indicate that that the aspirational is helpful, especially when we're having discussions with developers or with a community organization, because sometimes all of a sudden you realize that you could get a win-win out of something, and if you didn't have it somewhere on the table as a possibility, you might miss it. Again, I think it depends on what kind of building you're building. If it's a senior building, childcare is less important. And so, but there may be something else that's more important for that population. So I think part of this is identifying the population and their needs.
Yeah, and I think the point I was trying to make is not to offer people a whole Christmas tree, but was rather to keep some of these things front of mind as we're thinking about it. I think if we're thinking about housing, it's too often easy for us to think about just a building. And people can get isolated very easily, and because they don't have the services nearby. And so I think what I would just encourage us to do is not to broaden this too big, too much, or not have benchmarks that we hold ourselves accountable to, but have some indicators in here that force us to think beyond just the brick and mortar building and having somebody a place to live, which is not going to create an inclusive, healthy community if they don't actually have the services and the ability to actually live a thriving life in the community. So,
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that point. I just question whether the housing strategy is where you put that. Do you put that instead when we're talking about the economic development goals? And we're talking about what are the types of businesses that we want to try to actively encourage to come and relocate to the city? Or if we're talking about, and I think Councilmember Smith is absolutely right, there are plenty of resources out there to try to encourage, particularly for lower income families, different kinds of childcare programs that would have federal funds available, that if you have the right kind of connections, you can have the right spaces affordable for certain facilities to be a part of. We may actually have a lot of in-home childcare facilities that are here. And then we could better organize them, but I also question whether or not that would be something that would be a part of an economic development section and not necessarily in the housing component.
Councilwoman Costa, do you want to say one more thing, or should we
Yeah, I just wanted,
decide we're going to disagree on this point and
Yes,
move on?
and this isn't directly to that point. I just wanted to make the point that, to me, where it intersects with housing a little bit is how we look at planning in the city in terms of where things go. So more than necessarily us being able to provide healthcare for people or being able to provide healthy food, grocery stores for people, it might be that we prioritize new, larger scale developments near some of those amenities. So near the rec center, for example, or near a park, or close to a child care center that exists already. Things like that. I think it gets more into the location that we want to prioritize for some of these things. And then sort of on another tangent that I think we will need to coordinate this plan with is the way that we look at transportation in the city. So if we have newer, larger buildings along New Hampshire Avenue, for example, or other places, we're going to have to make sure that there are sidewalks for people. We're going to have to make sure that it's accessible to transit. And I think we're going to want to look at overall, as we're working on housing and economic development, the way that impacts traffic throughout the city, and do it in a way that encourages people to walk and to bike and use transit rather than drive.
All right. Well, we'll be interested to see what the housing goal looks like when it comes back to us again. Moving on to
We'll decorate it like a Christmas tree. It'll
yeah.
be nice.
The housing strategy. So on the first page, we have the City Council supports and advocates for a coordinated housing strategy. And we have 3 bullets. Anyone want to have any? Councilwoman DeBala?
Yeah, I had some questions. In the first one, do we mean development or essentially do we mean redevelopment, because there's just not a lot of extra room in Tacoma Park? Or do we mean both? It's a rhetorical question, Sarah. I don't think there's an actual answer to it.
I think any development is redevelopment. If in Tacoma Park, there's not like we're gonna take over vacant space, particularly.
Or vacant space.
Exactly.
On the
But I think
sorry.
I think that this really goes to, when we look through the indicators, identifying what kinds of structures we have enough of, and which ones we need either to save or improve or change, and to meet these other goals.
Okay. On the second one, I like walkable as a goal and a strategy. There's a part of me that's a little troubled because not everybody can walk. And so I don't know how we finesse that with a footnote or an explanation that walkable means out of your car and not just literally walkable, because it may mean bikeable.
Right.
Despite the feelings
Well,
of
the
some.
walkable neighborhoods is that score, but it's broader than walking.
Yeah, it's much broader than walking.
Right, and so
It deals with sidewalk accessibility, what you see when you're out walking, if you're hot or you're being beaten down by, because you don't have a tree canopy, or large gaps of vacant property or abandoned property. It deals with a whole variety of aspects and not just someone getting on a sidewalk and walking down the road.
Right,
So it's sort of one of those industry
Industry
phrases,
word.
It's kind of
if you
a,
will.
yeah, it's kind of a shortcut word, but maybe there's a way that we note that don't just have to walk.
Yeah, and not everybody can, so,
Exactly.
okay. And then, on the third one, you could read it to not directly include renters, which troubled me the first time I read it. And then I also, recognizing that the statistics show that young adults' housing in the city is dropping, I just wondered about leading with young adults.
Well, that's why we're trying to attract them. I didn't take this as saying that this doesn't, for a number of these categories would prefer rental housing. I mean, rental housing is a legitimate goal for many people. And so I didn't read it that way.
Yeah, I didn't the second time, but since I did the first time, I thought I'd bring it up and see if I'm the
No.
only one. Apparently I am. Okay. So the intention is renters and homeowners, not just homeowners.
No, it deals,
Yes.
the intention is to identify a broad range of individuals that have, on the surface at least, different housing needs or desires.
And I should say, by the way, that this is a mammoth effort and really hard to do. And this is just a great point to start talking from. This is very well done, in my view. But nevertheless, just raising those points.
Well, I think,
For
one of the
consideration.
things that was an interesting point in Councilmember Kovar's comments was the question about, are we building and keeping housing just for people who live here? Or what do we do with, how do we attract? And so part of the discussion that you'll need to kind of come up with is, are there some missing gaps, are there some gaps in our groupings for us as a community that we need to help provide for? And, is it enough to just say, if you're here, you're safe and you're good and we got you? Or do we talk about, recognizing that some people will move out, some people will move in, but how do we try to keep a certain mix and what that looks like? So it's a good conversation.
And to that point, I was going to say, when we get to housing objectives, on the first one, that welcoming might cover. It might fit nicest,
The what?
most nicely in there.
I didn't hear the word you said.
Welcoming,
A welcoming.
but I'll hold that for later.
I think also for Councilmember Kovar's point, some of the places where we use resident, in residence, we should maybe just say people, because residents, it sounds like we're talking about people who are already here. And I think in a couple of places in the earlier slides, like on the housing strategy, if we just say people rather than residents, that might alleviate some of the impression that he was saying it gave.
Well, yeah, but not all the way through, because I think that a lot of these really are most appropriate for existing residents. So we can sort that out. I take your point.
Councilman Costick?
I just have a suggestion in the first bullet to add the word quality or high quality. So it says encourages the development and preservation of a diverse range of high quality or good quality housing that is affordable.
Where's that?
In the first bullet point,
Oh.
encourages before the word housing
Mm-hmm.
to add quality or high quality.
Could someone define high quality for me?
No, I was going to say that before. I was like, oh.
Well, I'm not trying to be,
No, that's the truth.
I mean, it's a question, because what is high quality housing for that MHP might provide through one of their low-income housing tax credits might be different. I mean, it's still high quality, but it's different than what might appeal to someone who's looking at a single-family home or.
It may be better to, I mean, I'm not gonna put this, but it may be better to really focus on not low quality. I think that certainly we have identified here in some of the indicators, you don't want too many code violations, that kind of thing. I know when we have talked with people in some of the apartment buildings are getting older, so if you're just, you have enough money to afford the unit, but you could get nicer appliances for the same amount of money somewhere else, you might go somewhere else. And so part of that is, it's gonna be hard to define, I think.
But I do think it's important for the council to, start thinking about what that floor for the city is. And I don't think that the floor for the city should be the same as the floor that the county has when it comes to inspections, right?
Well, they're different. Yeah, they're totally different.
They're totally different. And so I think it is helpful if we start to have some conversations, at least from the perspective of the city, what are the minimal needs of a rental unit or a unit should possess? Like, what are the minimal characteristics that we think are acceptable here? And I think that would put us in a better position when we're having conversations with current landlords about, the level of, the maintenance or quality of their units over time.
So maybe that's when we have down the road, the strategic plan, finalizing it, there may be a section or something that, not a complete definition of high quality, but getting to that place. So, and that might, well, Councilwoman Demal isn't here, but that also might intersect nicely with some of the sustainability and energy efficiency work in multifamily units that.
And for single family.
And single
I think
family,
it's, there's a real issue of problems in single family homes.
Yeah. And some of it may be, what's the minimum and then what's the goals we want to set. That might be a good. Good. All right. Councilmember Smith, you have something on the strategies?
Yeah, it might be helpful to say, if we are going to talk about quality and we can set a floor and the minimum type of like plumbing, whether it's copper rather than galvanized, or we can say that, we want the electrical to be heavied up in the last 5-10 years or something, because there are a lot of these, especially the garden style apartments, that is not that's not there. And you would think in 2018 that would be a standard quality type of convenience in an apartment, but it's not provided to residents. So I think that would be something that would be helpful to let especially landlords know, that we want you to at least have this minimum for your tenants. And then the other thing is on facilitates public and private investment. Where would foundations be in that? Would they private?
I just consider that private.
Okay, all right,
Yeah.
thank you.
All right, moving on to housing objectives. The first slide has offer a variety of housing types for a diverse demographic, facilitate moderate and higher density infill development and mixed-use residential redevelopment. Any,
Did we go down to,
sorry, did I mess up my pages? I did, sorry.
okay, good.
The next one-
You're reading the wrong.
Reading the wrong one, all right, let me read off, all right, next one is housing objectives, support of actions by public, private, and nonprofit partners, create home ownership and rental opportunities in character-rich, walkable neighborhoods throughout the community, maintain the long-term affordability and physical condition of existing housing stock. Any changes there, or suggestions? Councilwoman DeBala?
So I wondered if welcoming might be useful in here between character-rich and walkable. And I also wondered if so create opportunities, is it create and maintain opportunities, or is it create opportunities, because we don't have any yet? I'm wondering about what create makes it sound like we don't have opportunities now, and maybe that's true, but probably not. And I wondered about that verb and what you meant by it.
Just to ensure that the opportunities are available. I wasn't,
Well, like that, like that.
So, I mean, I think it makes sense, I mean, if you want create and maintain, I mean, I think where they're there, we want, you know, that's part of the preservation aspect, but,
you could do ensure,
like
provide, maintain.
so ensure home ownership and rental opportunities are in
Exist.
character-rich, walkable neighborhoods throughout the community.
Okay, moving on to the next slide. What's the next one? I'm not gonna look at.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Well, you mentioned a couple times welcoming, and so, character-rich, welcoming, walkable neighborhoods?
Mhm.
Maybe not.
Councilmember Smith, did you have a suggestion?
No,
Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm going to the next
Slide, all right.
point. When we say maintain the long term, what do we mean, and how do we define affordability?
That is the perfect question. There is a term that I learned over the last 2 weeks called NOAA, which is naturally occurring affordable housing. And this sort of focuses on that. Those are those properties that by their nature or location, size, condition, whatever, are naturally affordable or naturally occurring affordable. They're not subsidized, they're not incentivized. It's just a house that's the right size, the right price for someone with an interest in moving in there. So when you're talking about affordability, a lot of it has to do with what Grace or I can afford and the rest of the members of the council, as well as other members of the community. So the affordability has more to do with the income that you are bringing in that you can use to pay for that particular housing opportunity. And it kind of shows up a little bit in the indicators when we were talking about linking housing prices, be it rental or home ownership, to various levels of the area median income.
So there's also a couple ways of looking at it. So you'd have to identify those things that are just kind of naturally occurring versus those things that are constructs, such as our rent stabilization program. There's also kind of longer term affordability for homeownership, where there's some kind of keys to, you know, whether it's, you know, the land grant kind of thing, or, you know, a variety of different ways to keep limited equity in a potential property over time. So there are some of those options out there. They're always challenging, and they change as time goes by.
Good. Councilwoman Costick?
Yeah, just through that discussion, it occurred to me that we might want to state somewhere, and I was actually looking back at the housing goal as maybe a place, maybe somewhere else, that we want to ensure that there are affordable and stable housing options and opportunities available to residents at a variety of price points. Not just, I mean, what's affordable, as you were saying, what's affordable to one person is not what's affordable to everyone. So at a variety of different people at a variety of different income levels, something that is affordable.
Yeah, I think the
to
council
them.
priority actually does mention that.
Okay.
So how we identify that, it certainly is part of the indicators that we've proposed here, but it's not explicitly said.
Do we want to make it explicit?
In terms of the indicators? So,
Or the
I'm sorry, I was just trying to make sure I'm catching
I'm
up.
like, yeah, I missed this.
No, well, so the, when we talk about availability at different price points, I mean,
Yeah.
that's part of the reason we can look at, you know, the average median income, you know, see the, you know, are you in this category or this category? Is there
Right.
something for you in these different categories? Yeah, so that was part of why that's there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when we actually start talking about some of the indicators, I think that there are some proxies for that there in terms of like AMI or cost burden. Now, whether or not we would ever get a denominator for that is a whole nother question. But so those would be indicators. One thing that I did not see was elements related to like racial diversity and trying to ensure that when we're actually looking at some of the indicators, that it's not just about, you know, affordability in terms of AMI is important, but also as it relates to the racial makeup of the community and making sure that we're not, by default, which is something I'm definitely concerned about in my ward, as development happens, you know, you start to gradually see residents of color being priced out of the community. And although we may still be adding to our overall, you know, air quotes, affordable number of units, it's to the detriment of residents in the community. So, I mean, I do think that when we start talking about some of these indicators, that we try to think of some ways to at least try to I know it's going to be difficult to quantify that kind of stuff, but just trying to think creatively about ways in which we can try to ensure that we maintain the racial diversity that we currently have.
So
especially
one,
as we
you
start to
know,
think
one of
about
the
development.
one of the easier ways is really to look at it on a ward basis. And that's something that, I mean, although there'll be redistricting coming up, it still is a good way to keep those kinds of statistics and to show, you know, as we look at each project, through our race equity considerations, what's the impact with this? Does it make a difference? And, you know, and I think that it works in each ward to a different extent, and may cause us different strategies for that ward.
Yeah, and I definitely think it's going to be a big issue as we start talking about some of these mixed-use infill development projects,
Right.
where it's private property, we may not have the ability or the sticks in terms of trying to encourage the development of, you know, of rent control units in the ways in which we would prefer, right? So if we find ourselves in a situation, what are some ways that we can try to ensure that with some of this infill development, that we are making it clear that we are prioritizing maintaining of affordable housing, and that we're prioritizing, trying to identify ways through programming or some other means of maintaining the cultural diversity of the community.
If in fact that is a objective, then we should be stating it as a clear objective,
I
not
was
just
actually-
saying we're going to.
I was actually going to ask that we could add one that said adopt policies and programs that address historical racial inequalities. Specifically, we could look at, and I think this falls under some of the things that we looked at before, the studies show Zoning, particularly zoning that pushes lower density, actually has a disparate impact on communities of color. There's, as Councilwoman Costick has mentioned, transportation issues, and credit and wealth, generation and wealth gaps. And one of the things that we talked about when we put in place the home stretch program was trying to address generational wealth gap with helping people with their down payment assistance. So I think there's some ways of working that in there. And I know I shared with my colleagues over the weekend a report that the Urban Institute had done for us. We had asked them after they did the report from Montgomery County on racial inequities if they could pull out some of the things for specifically for Tacoma Park. And so there may be already some benchmarks that we could look at in there to think about. What are you thinking?
I just don't. One of the things that you might also want to take into consideration is with the economic development side of this, where we're talking about workforce development and income and wealth building and jobs and all of that, that may also have an impact in terms of the affordability of property, regardless of any number of factors that could also have be more impactive on the racial equity side, as opposed to tying it specifically to who lives where and how much they're paying for rent. Does that make sense?
I think that both things are at work. And so, obviously, you know, if we all had the same amount of money, that's one way to deal with it. But the discussion we had with the Community Foundation folks was very interesting about how do they, what do we do for workforce development here, and how can that improve? You know, the whole issue of the Purple Line as an opportunity to get to jobs so that you can make more money is important. But at the same time, the impact on housing prices is, you know, can offset that. So all of that, I think, does need to be explicit in how we consider things. And, you know, we do want to develop more capacity of residents for making money, as well as monitor and have wise choices in the kind of development that gets done.
Yeah, and one of the things, you know, in just looking at that Urban Institute report, when they looked at the ACS data on home ownership rate right now in Tacoma Park, the rate's 74% among whites, 23% among blacks, and 43% among Latinos. So I think that is one thing we can look at as we're moving forward.
Yeah, I'm just not quite sure what kind of a program we've developed to do that.
Well, I think it would be making sure that the outreach around different, like home stretch, it's specifically targeting, which I know that you all are doing right now, but really trying to make sure that we're partnering with folks like Casa de Maryland and other groups to try to really target current residents or other people of color, you know, like NACA, all of those different other programs that exist for home ownership that typically target people of color. How can we make sure that we're putting Tacoma Park as not like this place that is totally out of reach for you? Because most people, you say Tacoma Park and they say, oh, you must be rich. So if you don't know, if Tacoma Park is viewed as this very expensive, very affluent neighborhood, and if we are in the early stages, maybe we get wind of new townhome developments or other types of projects that we may have underway, then we could start planting the seeds so that we could try to encourage people of color to try to get access to those funds and buy into the community.
You know, the other thing too is the partnership that we would want for some of the new development, and it may come with foundation funds or governmental funds from the county. Obviously, there is I guess they still call it productivity housing, affordable units that as you build anything that's new, but you know, being really forceful, I think, about making those connections is important. it's also a place where we may want to consider some more condominium conversion if it's a step into home ownership. And, you know, I hesitate about that. I have, you know, that's, but it really is part of the mix. I think we have to think about it as we look citywide.
Councilwoman DeBala?
Oh, on this topic, I was gonna ask a question and make a comment. So in Ward 2, at least, there are a number of elderly African-American families and increasingly single seniors living in homes and feeling the pressure. So that's another piece of the few people, the lower percentage of people of color who own homes, does it skew older and long-term and former Prince George's County? I'm thinking it might. And so what can we do? That's a specific thing we can focus on, if there's something we can do to help with that. But my other question was, if we have census data or ward data, race data by ward, can we see it?
We have
Do I
that-
have it and I
You-
have lost it?
You have it, we can resend it to you.
Thank you.
The tricky part with that is that the census,
The tracks
the
don't
wards
match
and the census tracks don't match up.
Right,
Yeah.
that's
So
the,
it's
from
a
the very,
best guesstimate from my
Yeah.
understanding.
yeah, that's true of all of the data that we're using from the housing and economic development study to start with. All of it is not precise to the wards, right?
Well,
It's precise to the census
To the
tract and the
census
block
tracts.
group with
Right.
acknowledgement that some overlap various wards.
Right.
So if you look at it, it's tied to the census tract as opposed to the ward specifically.
Right, I don't remember seeing
And
them.
it's not specific to houses. I mean, so you have to find out that information in a different way. It's part of, and because we're below 20,000, we don't get counted a certain way by the American Community Survey. It's really a problem. So how we proxy that information, how we use the residents survey, other kinds of door-to-door stuff, you know some of the residents, you know, are some of the ways that we would have to try to fill in those data gaps.
Okay, I'll take another look at the report. I don't remember the cultural and race data by census tract in here, but I'll look. Thank you.
Great, all right. So hearing no objections, I imagine we all agree adding an objective specifically on racial equity? And, all right, and I can.
Yep.
If you send me
I
something.
can send you some stuff. I have a bunch of stuff. All right, so then I've completely lost my place. The next slide is, we did this one. All right, the next one, objectives, offer a variety of housing types for a diverse demographic, facilitate moderate and higher density infill development and mixed-use residential and redevelopment. Councilwoman Costick.
To the point I was making earlier, I would like to add to the first point there, offer a variety of housing types at different price points for a diverse demographic, to address the point of not just housing types being apartments, condos, and townhouses and single-family homes, but that they are also at a range of economic levels as well.
Councilwoman DeBala. Oh, were you done? Yep, Councilwoman DeBala.
I was wondering what you meant by higher density. What are the zoning, were you thinking zoning limits on that? Were you thinking
Yeah,
particular
basically the
neighborhoods?
FAR, or the number of stories in a building, or the square footage.
So just what does that look like in some of the more densely zoned neighborhoods?
I would have to, I guess it would vary depending upon the specific site. But so, for example, along New Hampshire Avenue, the way the zoning ordinance is written now, you could have a 7-story building on.
7 stories, not 70. Yeah, okay.
On the rec center, whereas in other areas, it would be less, potentially.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Smith.
And how do you see us facilitating these projects?
I think the easiest one will be the rec center, because you have more control over that particular property as far as molding the type of project that you want at the back end. Another opportunity is to continue conversations and offer partnerships like which is being proposed for the Washington Adventist Hospital site, in terms of having interactions and developing relationships with people that either own large plots of land or are looking at redeveloping an existing building or structure. So a lot of it's going to be relational development initially, because we don't have any control over any property with the exception of the rec center, which we don't quite have yet. And our access to resources that would be at an impactive level in terms of providing enough of an incentive to encourage someone to do something a little out of the norm are fairly limited. So that would be needing to access additional funding, be it at the governmental level or through a foundation or through tax incentives like tax increment financing or the opportunities zone, enterprise zones.
Well, I just don't want us to, repeat what happened with the New Hampshire Avenue strategic plan. Come up with all these ideas of what we want to see, and residents expect all these things to happen, but we don't have any control over, what the landlords are going to do. So, it would be great if we could achieve the same goal but go after it in a different way, meaning reach out to foundations and say, we want to do something. We want to have some type of project, and see if they will buy in and, be a partner with us, and then go after like a J&A or part of Washington Adventist Hospital campus, rather than saying that we're going to try to facilitate these things. That's something that we've said as a previous councils on numerous occasions. But that doesn't necessarily mean that anything's ever going to happen.
I agree, and the challenge is that we don't have control over any land. When the New Hampshire Avenue Corridor concept plan was initially developed, we went out and approached a variety of foundations and nonprofit affordable housing providers to attempt to sort of pique their interest and redevelop the corridor site. Again, the challenge is it's privately owned land. Unless a particular property owner is interested in selling or redeveloping it, there's very little you can do until that opportunity becomes available. So when I use the word facilitate, it's to put the pieces in place so that when an opportunity does become available, or there's a glimmer of a possibility of nudging somebody over the line so that they're redeveloping their property, that we have everything in place.
There's a couple other things too. There may be some rezoning that the city wants to champion. And that's something that is a really big discussion. But, when we look at something like the Washington Adventist Hospital property, well, it could be single-family homes. And that's probably not the best use of that property to meet a variety of community goals. And so the partnerships that look at that, there are a few things that can be done under the existing zoning, but there may be something that we want to change over the long term. So there are some ways that we can facilitate, which is to change either by text amendment or zoning map amendment the underlying parameters that you could attract something. The other part of that is that where there's an option, such as on the hospital property, you've already got a 7-story building there. If we end up with something that has, senior housing or something, you could build it 7 stories. It's still hidden by the trees, or it's along where the people are used to seeing a building. And so that also helps facilitate that higher density development that doesn't necessarily pop off the page when you look at the zoning map.
What if we said facilitate and encourage? I'm just saying it's a little stronger, and I think it sends a very different message versus, like, this is something we actively want to support.
Would that help you? Okay.
One other thing, you gave us an example, I don't know if it was 6 months ago, 8 months ago, of a municipality that worked with the foundation. They built a bunch of affordable housing units. You look as though you don't remember.
I'm drawing a blank right now, so.
Okay. All right, well, my question was, did they already own the land, or did they bring in the foundation as a partner and then went out and said, we're going to acquire land and build these affordable housing units?
Typically, the model is where the local government owns the property. So for example, when, you know, is it 5 stories on New Hampshire Avenue that's been empty forever by the church? So for example, with that one, the folks that are doing the affordable housing development where the police station used to be on Silver Spring, we brought them in and showed them what the possibilities were with the building in terms of potential site plans, zoning, and all of that. But then, and they were very, very interested in that. But then when you end up talking to the property owner, while they may be very enthusiastic about it, they also have a price point, if you will, that they're very interested in. So we've had those contacts and those conversations with a variety of people over the years. It just happens when the stars are all aligned as far as something actually going forward. But it's important to develop those relationships, be prepared to make those tough decisions in terms of rezoning or approving additional density on a site like the campus, to make sure that everybody understands that you're very interested in proceeding with this plan, creating additional housing opportunities, looking at the possibility of higher development on some of these sites that in the past have been underutilized from an economic or zoning perspective.
There's a number of times when we also see that kind of a action taking place when it's a tenant opportunity to purchase on a building.
Councilwoman Searcy?
Yeah, and I think this is another case of where different issues overlap, right? So when you have vacant properties, be it commercial or privately owned properties, and there are no real disincentives from a financial standpoint to prompt a landowner or property owner to get rid of a property, especially given, I mean, just keep in mind where we're located and what is expected to happen here. I could clearly see why someone would want to hold out for what they perceive to be the big dollar. And if they're not having to incur a fee for having what is in essence a vacant property in the city, what disincentive do they have to get rid of what they, to unload without, there's no recourse. So I do think it's important for us to kind of think of how all of these different factors relate to one another. Because it may, Councilmember Smith, to your point, it may actually prompt us to actually take a long, hard look at how are we dealing with our vacant properties in the city, and what should we start charging folks to kind of motivate people who are holding property just for the sake of holding them to let them go.
And have we ever asked owners if they would be willing to be development partners in a project rather than just outright selling it?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's move on to the next slide. This is the final objective. And this one is the advocate for local, county, and state decisions, policies, legislations, regulations, and funding in support of these objectives. Yes. All right, let's move on now to the indicators.
Oh, can we add
Oh, sorry.
federal? Federal?
Yeah, it was supposed to be in.
Oh, yeah.
there.
I'll add it.
Yeah, when that federal money comes rolling in.
Indicators, I think, just to kind of recap before, some of the things we had talked about is not just having indicators by ward, but thinking about some of these of having overall, knowing that there's gonna be some give and take on.
Yeah, I think this is almost the only slide that mentioned wards, maybe one other one did. So there may be other places where we also do want to identify wards as well.
Yeah. Mhm. Any thoughts on these? Councilman DeBala?
Yeah, my, I thought a lot about the distinction between indicators and indicators that are actually numeric goals, keying off of what Councilmember Searcy started to say before. I was thinking about the the Sustainable Energy Action Plan, and the indicator was greenhouse gas emissions. And I like having indicators. I'm not completely sure about having numeric goals because so many things are not in our control. And getting the data, updating the data, keeping all of that current, as I think you said, is a huge task in and of itself. And I'm just not sure how to navigate that. On the Sustainable Energy Action Plan, it's proven to be, that was an outside consultant, as this was, to develop the initial data. And then keeping it up, luckily, has been essentially work with COG as opposed to staff work here. So I don't know if we're going to get that lucky twice. And I wonder whether we are headed down this road for a number of programs or only for housing. While housing is a very important goal, are we also going to then try to mirror this in other programs? If this is the direction that the council wants to go in generally, then that might make me feel better than just having these, but not for anything else. That said, I thought that a lot of the indicators, as indicators, made a great deal of sense and really illustrated the points that we were trying to get at in terms of having a stretch for the city and trying to capture what we'd like to see here.
I think Ms. Daines made the point earlier that, they do need to be countable and not a difficulty on measurement. Obviously, the percent increase in rental housing rates, that's easy. We'll be able to count home ownership and renter occupancy pretty easily. We keep better data than most places because of our rent stabilization program. And so.
Yeah. And all of the indicators that are included in these slides are easily researched.
And I would also say to Councilwoman DeBala, to the larger point, I think to a certain extent, and we do this when we do the budget each year, we do have indicators for each of the departments. I think each year we talk about
finding them better.
Right.
That's right.
Defining them better, having some, and thinking, and systematically thinking about them, and what they're really measuring, and are they the correct indicators that match with the priorities that the council has set. So I think this process I'm very supportive of having the indicators and doing this process, because I actually would like to see it mirrored in other, as we go through other departments or priorities that we have. Let's see, where am I? Councilwoman Searcy.
Ditto. I think this honestly is just a good policy practice for us, right? It's very easy to set goals, but if you don't have any targets and you don't have any way to really tie the outcomes of your different programs and projects to those targets, then you have no way of being able to demonstrate how successful you are at achieving your intended goal. Now, I agree. I think a number of these indicators are going to fluctuate, and it's going to depend on so many different factors. It could be the case that we're doing a bang-up job with what we're doing, but because of what's happening in the region, stuff may still happen, and that's okay. But at least we would know enough. We would have the evidence to say what we are doing is working, but these outside factors we're still not seeing where we need to be. And then we may also be able to tailor some of our projects to better align with what's happening. So, but you wouldn't be able to do that if you weren't actively monitoring not just indicators for the area, but also as they pertain to your respective programs.
So does anyone have anything on, I think we have like, what, 4 or 5 pages on the indicators? One of the things that I noticed, I think is a good indicator for us to keep is the percentage of housing cost burdened homeowners and renters. I think we should also, though, put in there severely cost burdened, because in the report, we have 14% of renters are severely cost burdened. And, you know, thinking about, as we've had conversations about how affordable housing is going, lots of times it's those folks who are on the lowest income levels that are left out of a lot of programs, or when we're thinking about different housing in the county. And so I'm very, I want us to keep a close eye on the severely cost burden and see what we can do with that.
And just, you know, just as a reminder, for, particularly for those that are severely cost burdened or that have residents who've got disabilities of various kinds, that's the perfect place for the county to step in on some of this. And, you know, that's the partnership that we should be having with the county on that, I think, is critical.
Quick question about the cost burden. So where would we get that? Like,
It's magical.
because when I saw it, I immediately thought, oh, this is like maybe like some kind of
It's through the
It's
census.
census
American
data,
Community
which
Survey.
means you're not going to get it regularly.
It's ACS survey
It takes a
data.
while, so
ACS.
we
Yeah.
dated and stuff. One of the things I brought, and I'll distribute later, is that when we did the community conversation thing back 2 years ago, I believe, in February, maybe three,
almost
a while
three.
ago, seems like it. One of our, one of the materials that was handed out was, showed a variety of this information on a block group basis, which you can, if you look at the map, you can see how it applies to your ward. So you will be able to see more specifically home ownership, rental rates, cost burden, both for homeowners as well as renters. So when we get done, I can hand that out to you.
Right, and the ACS data is done more frequently than the
Then-
census
so,
tract.
so this did come from the ACS?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
the,
it's,
so the,
it's done more frequently.
right, so the ACS for our size of jurisdiction is for every, is averaged over 5 years. So we get it every year, but it's for a 5-year period. So you have to like, you can compare between them, but you can't just take the number. And so it is a monitoring situation as opposed to a completely accurate data set.
Any other?
Just one
Councilmember
quick
Smith?
question. How do we compare to other jurisdictions when you look at the percentage of rental versus ownership?
Tacoma Park, when I first moved here, I was told it's a very unique community, and it is a very unique community. There is no standard as far as how homeownership should compare to rental. It just depends on those unique features that make up a community.
If we
Could
look
we-
at the areas around us, in the past, there were a lot fewer renters, just because of the nature of how many apartment buildings there are. That's changing, especially with the buildup in Hyattsville and in Silver Spring and whatever. And so I think, you know, we're seeing a lot of difference there. Now, our costs for what you get is still very low for the apartments. And, you know, the rent stabilization program really sets us in a different category.
Yeah.
And that's been very fortunate for us because it's kept us pretty stable as the rest of the housing market went higher.
Just to give you an indication of how it varies dramatically, in Montgomery County as a whole, as of July 1st of 2017, 66% of the residents were in owner-occupied housing units, as compared to 51% of Tacoma Parks. So it varies dramatically from community to community.
Councilwoman Costick.
Excuse me, I had a couple of different thoughts. On the first indicator, I feel like I'm really struggling with whether or not these measurements are really measuring what we want with the objective. And I keep going back and forth in my head about whether they are or aren't. A part of me feels like, although we do want to diversify within each ward what we have in terms of housing stock, it also seems to me that more in general, we want to increase home ownership rates, or we want to increase rental housing rates. I'm just afraid in looking at this that the risk is we increase home ownership rates in Ward 4 and 5, which might likely be conversion to condos in a fairly large number. There aren't an equivalent number of spaces in most of Ward 1, 2, and 3 to really replace those in a lot of cases. I mean, in some cases, we might have opportunities to build a new, larger development, but in most cases, it seems to me that would be a net loss for rental housing. So I'm just struggling with whether it makes sense to include the wards here, or if there's something else we need to be measuring here to achieve our goal.
Well, I guess I have
This
to,
goes with-
I'm sorry.
No, I was gonna say, I think it goes back to the conversation of also having the overall
Yeah, I think there's an
goal and
overall
fitting
goal.
these and
The-
then-
You know, the other thing, I guess there's a couple things. One is that I really push to put words in here, and partly as a challenge, because often when we talk about housing provision, it's for everywhere except for my neighborhood. And so really trying to say, okay, well, what happens in my neighborhood? There's things about my neighborhood I like and I want to preserve, but maybe I need to change something so that it meets the greater good. So when we talk about the accessory dwelling units, whether it's a small house in the backyard or additional units in the house, that may be a good place to get rental units in wards 1 and 2. Wards 1 and 2 differ a little bit in that a lot of Ward 2 doesn't have driveways versus Ward 1 does, so there's some differences about that. But it may be a way, is it gonna offset a large building? Maybe not, but it might offset some garden-style apartments that convert. And so thinking about that is, that's really a, you know, this ward and that ward kind of thing, as opposed to looking citywide, which I think we need to do. But there are some ways that we can look at it even at that lower level.
Yeah, I think it's good if we maintain the focus on the objective rather than trying to achieve specific numbers. In this case, if the goal, if someone working on this is looking at, it's so important that I increase home ownership rates in Ward 4, you could potentially lose sight of the objective.
But
So
I
I think
think
just
this-
making sure that you're focusing on the overall objective and picture.
Right, but I think this goes into the race equity question. And so part of this is that we may need to change the home ownership rates in Ward 4, and we may need to change the percent of home ownership in Ward 1, and as part of that. So
I agree, and I think we should, and one of my other comments was that I think we should add measurements by race to address the additional objective that we added earlier to look at percentage of home ownership increasing among people of color. But I also think, I also don't want us to get trapped into a mindset that people of color are going to naturally end up in Ward 4, 5, and 6, that they should have opportunities in Wards 1, 2, and 3 as well. So that it's not that we're measuring wards based on demographics, because the idea is that those demographics might change in the process.
One of the tricky things with that particular indicator, in terms of percentage of people of color that own a home, because of our size, we're not going to be able to get that information. And there aren't.
There's that microphone on, right?
That's, you turn it on. I've been saying push it.
So let me also say this, and we've talked a little bit about what indicators are. And I think it may be helpful for council to really take this outside of hard and fast numbers. Indicators give you an opportunity to then do a deeper analysis as to what's going on, especially as you look at, the ward specific objectives. I think it gives us something else to look at. It's not because of one factor or two factors. And so I wouldn't get caught up, many people see this as a strategic goal where we have to hit a goal, hit a number, hit a percentage. That's not what indicators are. Indicators give us something that we can't necessarily quantify. And so we use these percentages as a way of, almost like a substitution for something where you just can't put a number on it. And so I wouldn't get so caught in that, in trying to come up with a defined number. And I think what we can do on our end from the housing and community development side is to help you understand what's going on, and for you all also to understand what's going on. There are a lot of factors in play. I think Councilmember Smith's question about, so what's going on other places, I don't think that's going to help you in your decision-making, because there are factors outside of the control of other jurisdictions that they're not even looking at. I mean, we're doing a real in-depth look here at housing and helping Tacoma Park to become part of the cutting edge of what's going on. And so much of this won't be defined until you get going. At least that's my experience. And so I wouldn't get hung up. I know there are a lot of things about race and equity, and all of these things are a part of the large kind of what I call the salmagundi of housing. It's not just a salad of one ingredient, it's multiple ingredients. And so, I would hope that as you look at some of these terms, many of them mimic strategic plans, but an indicator is not necessarily that of a goal. It's something to consider in addition to other factors.
All right, Councilmember Siemens?
Sorry, I was just leaving that so I could yell if I had.
Okay. Councilmember Searcy, do you have your light on?
Yeah, I meant to turn it on.
Okay.
So, no, I totally agree. And I agree with Councilmember Kosik's point about, making sure that we have the overall number at play. But I also think that it is important for us to be mindful of the distribution by ward. Because we, quite frankly, are a bit segregated in terms of the types of space that are available. There's some areas of the city that have far more commercial and opportunity for mixed use than others. There's certain parts of the city that already have a large number of people of color that we want to try to provide opportunities to. Most people tend to buy where they live unless they're trying to exit, right? So if I live in Ward 4 and I want to buy a home, I'm first going to look in my immediate area, right? So I do think that it is important, like if we're trying to keep residents of color who currently live in wards, 4, 5, 6, that we try to be mindful of what kinds of home ownership opportunities may come up in those areas such that we can properly steer them.
Okay, so let me also say this about home ownership. Not everybody wants to be a homeowner.
Right.
Not everybody should be a homeowner. And making the opportunity available is different than people taking the next step in terms of home ownership. One of the things that I've started doing with our housing team is looking at the foreclosure rate in Tacoma Park specifically among single-family homeowners as well as condominiums. And there, I think, may be some stats that we can share with you about what's going on and why some of our homeowners who are living in condominiums may be facing foreclosure. I think that's, when we start talking about things that may convert from rental to condominium ownership, that's another factor. It's not just about, having a low mortgage. It's also about the common fees, the HOA fees, that can often tangle people in liens and other things. And so we want to look at, those factors as well. It's not affordable, even if it's a condominium, if you can't afford it. And with, the rent stabilization laws in the city of Tacoma Park, renting may be the best option for a lot of families, even if they're not cost burdened. People don't want to traditionally do not want to spend all of their income on housing. They have other priorities. And that may make this a fantastically livable city for a number of people, and they never want to own property. But for the people who do want to own property, and the council is familiar with a number of programs, including our first-time home buyer program, where we actually help people through our partners look at their credit to start somewhere that is foundational, which means, can you really afford to own a property, whether it's in the city of Tacoma Park or elsewhere? And do you have the tools and skills to maintain a household that's not a rental household? So again, when we start looking at indicators of where people are going, I think it's the city has to be livable for the people that live here and what their desires are. And not everyone's desire is either going to be in the rental market or in the home ownership realm. And to respect that means that we're not only making it a welcoming community, but we want people to stay here and thrive with their families. And so again, hard and fast it may not kind of work here, may not be the right fit, but I definitely understand the issues around creating diversity in locations so that it doesn't feel that it's somewhat segregated in certain areas. Yeah.
Councilwoman DeBala.
Yeah, all of which is to say, I agree that we need to be looking at specific ward distributions, but maybe there's an indicator, getting back to something you said at the very beginning, an indicator that gets tracked about the percentage overall of rental versus home ownership, to just make sure that, I don't know, do we just set a goal? Do we want to maintain it? Do we want to increase it to go back where it was? But let's at least track it so that we can stay on top of it and not 10 years from now find out
Yeah,
we
we
lost
will-
another 10 points.
We'll be tracking it, but I do think, the point that I've heard, I mean, certainly, we just heard it now, but in talking with younger people, there are many younger people that have no intention of ever buying. And so if our community ends up going to be 75% rental, that may be just fine. So I don't know that we can say that there's a goal for that. I think we just have to keep monitoring it and recognize that we're trying to match a mix of people to a mix of housing, and, we'll see how it goes.
And the other question I have has to do with the getting back to, we were talking about quality of housing. And so on the second indicator, there's one way of tracking, measuring quality. Did you consider, which is to look at the number of property maintenance code violations in multifamily facilities? Did you consider other ways of tracking quality, trying to get a handle on not just the existence of an apartment or a home, but the quality of that home?
No. No, we
'Cause
did
it's
not.
hard.
Because
It's real
there was,
hard.
when we were going through and looking at the indicators, we were pulling from data sources that we knew were available and would continue to be available going forward. The house, property maintenance code violations, yes, it's the bare bones of property conditions. But it is a good indication of how well property owners taking care of their building. It does not apply to owner-occupied houses, though.
Right. And so, one of the things that I've brought up several times is flooding in Tacoma Park. And the fact that certainly it affects apartments, but it affects the number of single-family homes. And that used to get flooded. When you have that, water is just incredibly demoralizing, and it really can ruin your property. And so that's, it may not be easy for us to count it or do that, but we may very well be coming to you, I may very well be coming to you with an approach to assist people kind of holistically at looking at flooding. And that also helps improve the quality of homes in Tacoma Park. It's not going to be something we find on a statistics, on a database.
Great. All right. With that, I think we will close out the evening before 10 o'clock. And I just want to say thank you very much for all the work that's going into this. As we started this evening talking about the process we've had in place, where this has started almost 3 years ago, that the council decided at the time to move and plan more on housing affordability. It's great to see that we've come this far, and look forward to more. So thank you very much for all this work.
Thank you.
And we're adjourned.